All right, today I want to turn, if you will, to Joshua, the book of Joshua, and I want to take some lessons from two chapters here, Joshua 6 and also in Joshua 7. When Israel went into the land of promise, God had told them that they would defeat their enemies, and indeed that was the case for the most part. We learn about the conquest of Jericho, which happens to be the very first city that the Israelites defeated when they came in the Promised Land. It was probably the strongest city in the land. There was probably no city stronger than Jericho. There may have been some equally as strong, but Jericho would have been considered among the strongest of all the cities. And therefore, a defeat of such a city as Jericho would surely cause great fear in the land. Because if Jericho was defeated, this great city, this great wall city, then who else could stand before the Israelites? And so when they come into the land, we learn in chapter 6 and verse 1 that Jericho was tightly shut because of the sons of Israel. No one went in or went out, and no one came in. And so here we see the state of mind of the people of Jericho. They were frightened. They had not only heard about what had taken place in Egypt and how God did great marvelous things there, but obviously they had heard of the most recent thing of them crossing the Jordan when it was at its highest point, crossing over on dry land. And when you hear about things like that, and you think, my, what power is behind these people, it would cause you to be afraid, very afraid. And so we begin reading in verse 2, and we're going to read down to verse 5. We're going to read sections and talk about them quickly. But it says, "And the Lord said to Joshua, See, I have given Jericho into your hand, with its king and its valiant warriors, and you shall march around the city, all the men of war, circling the city once. You shall do so for 6 days. And also 7 priests shall carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. Then on the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. And it shall be that when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat. And the people will go up every man straight ahead." And furthermore, we learn in verse 6 that God had also told Joshua, and Joshua conveyed this to the people in verse 10, that you shall not shout or let your voice be heard, nor let a word proceed out of your mouth until the day I tell you shout, then you shall shout. And so here we see this great battle plan, which must have perplexed Joshua, who was a commander of the armies of God. And I am sure that Joshua was somewhat perplexed by these battle plans, and that not only was he perplexed by them, and I mean perplexed in the sense of, well, how's this going to work? But the men of Israel would have been somewhat amazed at these battle plans. I mean, who ever heard of such a thing as this? God's instruction regarding the city and how it was to be taken really must have shocked Joshua and his army. And as one man pointed out, had there ever been a battle plan in the history of the world more calculated to invite the contempt and merriments of the one whom you are attacking than this? The people of Jericho were fearful already at what they had heard about the Israelites. They were fearful for their safety. The city was shut up tight. But by marching around the city as instructed by God, Israel would appear to be impotent against Jericho. I mean, this is no way to attack a city. This is no way to overcome this great mighty city. And so we see here that this battle plan was really an interesting one altogether. And I want to point out that it would take a great amount of faith. A great amount of faith on the part of Joshua and on the part of the people to accept these orders and to carry them out to a T. Where had they ever heard of such a plan? And again, it would take this great faith. And the question would be, would they be up to the task? Would they be up to the task of believing God, following God's orders? And we know the story. Beginning in verse 11, it says here that Joshua had the ark of God, or the ark of the Lord, taken around the city, circling it once. Then they came into the camp and spent the night in the camp. Now Joshua arose early in the morning, and the priests took up the ark. The 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets of the ram's horns before the ark of the Lord went on continually and blew the trumpets and the ram's horn before the ark of the Lord. Let me go back and read that. The 7 priests, verse 13, carrying the 7 trumpets of the ram's horns before the ark of the Lord went on continually and blew the trumpets, and the armed men went before them, and the rear guard came after the ark of the Lord while they continued to blow the trumpets. And thus the second day they marched around the city once and returned to the camp, and they did so for 6 days. And when you think of this scene, and you imagine, in my mind it would be somewhat spooky to see an army marching around the city. And if the whole army was involved, then can you imagine how this scene would be portrayed, or how this would look? I'm not certain the whole army was involved in these first stages. But even so, they would have to be far enough away from the walls to stop the arrows from being flung, and to stop whatever else they might be able to throw at them from being thrown and hit them. So they would have been pretty far out on the perimeter. And again, the bigger the army, the more further out they would have to be. But imagine this army marching around, and you hear the lowing of the horns. I have a bullhorn, and I know when you blow the bullhorn, it's a low sound. And of course, the bigger the horn, the lower the sound. But hear them blowing the horns, and the people marching, no sound being heard. You know, were the people thinking how silly this is? How funny this is? These people think that they're going to hurt us and scare us? Or were there people in the city who were frightened? I don't know. We're not told. But I do know this. That nobody in the city walls would expect what would happen on the next day, on the 7th day of these events. We continue to read the story in verse 15 of Joshua chapter 6. Then on the 7th day they arose early at the dawning of the day, and marched around the city in the same manner 7 times. Only on that day they marched around the city 7 times. At the 7th time, when the priest blew the trumpets, Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city shall be under the ban. It and all in it belongs to the Lord. Only Rahab the harlot and all who were with her in the house shall live, because she hid the messengers whom we sent. But as for you, only keep yourselves from the things under the ban, so that you do not covet them, and take some of the things under the ban, and make the camp of Israel accursed and being troubled on account of it. But all the silver and the gold and articles of bronze and iron are holy to the Lord. They shall go into the treasure of the Lord." So the people shouted, and the priest blew the trumpets. And when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted with a great shout, and the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight ahead, and they took the city. And so we see on the 7th day, on the 7th time they circled the city, when the priests blow the horns, Joshua commanded the fighting men to raise up a war cry. Raise up a great shout. But as he told them to do this, he also told them something that we're not sure he told them before, and that is that the whole city was put under a ban. The whole city was devoted to the Lord. And that's what this idea of being under a ban was. It was all devoted to the Lord. And therefore, it all belonged to the Lord. I think the best way to understand this is to remember that when you go back to the law, all the first fruits belong to the Lord. You remember that? All the first belong to the Lord of all things. And this was the first fruits of the land. When they come into the land, this is the first city. This is the first place that the Lord gives them. And so this would be given to the Lord. All this city belonged to the Lord. It was all devoted to Him. And therefore, none of it was to be taken by the people. All of it was to be left to be done with what the Lord would desire it to be done with, except for the silver and the gold and the precious metals, which would be taken into the treasure of the Lord. But everything else in the city was devoted to God, and everything else would be left for God's use or God's will. And we learn what that is, and that later on down when we learn that it would be utterly destroyed. taken away in that sort of way. We read that in verse 21. When they finished destroying the city or taking the city, it says here, they utterly destroyed everything in verse 21. In the city, both man and woman, young and old, ox and sheep and donkey with the edge of the sword. They burned the city with fire and all that was in it, only the silver and the gold, articles and the articles of bronze and iron, they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. So in that regard, the whole city was devoted to the Lord for His use and for His will. And the only thing that He wanted saved was the silver and the gold, then the precious metals, and the rest would be destroyed. So the whole of the city, along with its inhabitants, not including, or pardon me, including the animals and all the things in the city, was devoted to the Lord for utter destruction. For utter destruction. And therefore Joshua tells the people on this occasion, as he tells them to raise their shout, he tells them, do not take any plunder. Do not take any plunder, he says, for if you do this, you will make the camp of Israel accursed and bring trouble upon it. And the chapter really ends in a very upbeat way. It really does end in an upbeat way. The army of Israel is victorious over Jericho, and everybody's feeling well, everybody's feeling good until we get to the next chapter. And the next chapter, and keep in mind, these chapter divisions were put in there by men. The next chapter begins with but. With a but. And it reads, but the sons of Israel acted unfaithfully in regard to the things under the ban. For Achan, the son of Carmi, the son of Zabdi, the son of Zerah, from the tribe of Judah, took some of the things under the ban. Therefore the anger of the Lord burned against the sons of Israel. Now Joshua sent men from Jericho to Ai, which was near Beth-aven, east of Bethel, and said to them, go up and spy out the land. So the men went up and spied out Ai. And they returned to Joshua and said, do not let all the people go up. Only about 2,000 or 3,000 men need to go up to Ai. Do not make the people toil up there, for they are few. So about 3,000 men from the people went up there, but they fled from the men of Ai. The men of Ai struck down about 36 of their men and pursued them from the gate as far as Shebarim, and struck them down on the descent. So the hearts of the people melted and became as water. And when they heard about this, when Joshua heard about this, it caused great anxiety. We don't know where Ai was located. I would imagine that it wouldn't be far from Jericho, but it would be on the route they needed to take. But we don't really know where Ai was, except that it was east of Bethel or near Beth-aven. And I'm not even sure we know where Beth-aven was, but we really don't know exactly where this place was. But we do learn from the report of the spies that the city was few in number. Now, if they're few in number, when you go back and read later on, I think 12,000 men and women were killed. That doesn't sound, that's bigger than Milton. That's bigger than Milton. So I guess Jericho, if they consider this to be a small city, Jericho must have been a lot bigger because they consider this to be few in number, 12,000. I think maybe the spies maybe got it wrong, at least in their estimation of how strong the city was. But nevertheless, they said, we don't need to bring the whole army of God in here. We only need to bring a small number. Maybe they had just great faith that God would be able to destroy this city with a small number. I don't know. But they said, we don't need to bring the whole army up. And it would be enough if we just had 300 or 3,000 men. 2,000 to 3,000. So Joshua sent to 3,000. And I believe that all would have gone well had it not been for something that the people did not yet know about. God knew, of course, but the people did not know about. And so the people were overwhelmed. The 3,000 men were overwhelmed. And out of that number, 36 men were killed. And the army of God fled before these people, and they ran them down, it says, down the descent, ran them as far as Shebarim, and struck them down on the descent, and the people's heart melted and became as water. I just can imagine how they felt. And again, the question could be raised is, how could this happen? How could such a thing happen? Or more to the point, why would the Lord allow this sort of thing to happen to this people, this army of God? And I believe that's what's on Joshua's mind. In verse 6, we learn that Joshua tears his clothes and falls to the earth on his face before the ark of the Lord, and until the evening, both he and the elders of Israel. So it wasn't just Joshua, it was all the leading men of Israel falling down before the ark of the Lord, and they put dust on their heads, which indicates mourning, it indicates sadness. And Joshua says, "Alas, O Lord God, why did you ever bring this people over the Jordan, only to deliver us into the hands of the Amorites and to destroy us? If only we had been willing to dwell beyond the Jordan. O Lord, what can I say, since Israel has turned their back before their enemies? For the Canaanites and all the inhabitants of the land will hear of it, and they will surround us and cut off our name from the earth. And what will you do for your great name?" Now, I believe that the distress that Joshua has is truly understandable. It's truly understandable. A stunning defeat of Israel by a city that the Israelites themselves believed to be insignificant. A defeat by a small city like this would be a disaster. It would be a horrible disaster. A skilled commander that he was, Joshua knew that this defeat would be a morale booster to the Canaanites, to the Amorites, to the people living in the land. When they heard about Jericho falling, they would have been very discouraged. But to see that this small city would be able to defeat this grand army, well, that would give them a morale boost, and they would feel confident that they would not be, or they would be able to withstand Israel, and they would be able to fight them. And Joshua was concerned that there would be this massive counterattack against Israel by the whole population of Canaan. He just figured, we're doomed. When this word gets out, we are doomed. So he and the elders and the people fell to the earth before the ark of the Lord until the evening, morning, praying to God. And the summary of their prayer is as follows. They first of all asked God why He brought them into the land only to destroy them. The second part of the prayer is that they seem to cast some blame upon themselves for not being content to dwell on the other side of the land, but were desirous of a larger and better country. And now ruins seem to be the consequent of that covetous disposition. And that's what they say. We should have been content to live over there. We should have been happy to live over there. And so it seems like Joshua is somehow saying, well, it's our fault, God, because we wanted to come here. And then the final thing, and though it's mentioned last, I think it's the uppermost thing in Joshua's mind. And that is this, is that what would become of God's name? What would become of God's great name when the report that Israel had turned their back to their enemies? What would become of God's name? And if they were destroyed and left without a single trace on the earth, again, then how wilt thou preserve thy great name, which thou hast acquired thus far in the sight of the nations through the miraculous guidance? And I think that's what Joshua was asking God. Because now, if they were destroyed, what kind of commentary would that leave on God? God was able to bring them out of Egypt, but God was not able to bring them into the land. And so God would get a bad rap. And that's what Joshua was concerned about. And I really think that's the most significant thing that Joshua was concerned about. How will this look to the nations? How will this make God look to the nations? And really what it would make him look like is just another of the many gods, no more powerful, no more stronger than anybody else, and not to be feared. And God's response to this is recorded in verse 10 and following. So the Lord said to Joshua, "Rise up. Get up," He says. "Why is it that you have fallen on your face? Israel has sinned, and they have also transgressed my covenant which I commanded you. And they have even taken some of the things under the ban, and have both stolen and deceived. Moreover, they have also put them among their own things. Therefore, the sons of Israel cannot stand before their enemies. They turn their backs before their enemies, for they have become accursed. I will not be with you any more, unless you destroy the things under the ban from your midst. Rise up, he says, and consecrate the people, and say, consecrate yourselves for tomorrow. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel. This is what he has said. There are things under the ban in your midst, O Israel. You cannot stand before your enemies until you have removed the things under the ban from your midst. In the morning then you shall come near by your tribes, and it will be that the tribe which the Lord takes by lot shall come near by families, and the family which the Lord takes shall come by households, and the household which the Lord takes will come near man by man. And it shall be that the one who is taken with the things under the ban shall be burned with fire, he and all that belongs to him, because he has transgressed the covenant of the Lord, and because he has committed a disgraceful thing in Israel. In response to his supplication, God says, rise up, get up. Why is it that you have fallen on your face? And this is actually a rebuke to Joshua. This is actually a rebuke to Joshua. Joshua had no reason to doubt the faithfulness of God like he was doing. And there was a lack of fidelity to God. Now, I want to say in Joshua's defense that probably all of us would be this way to some degree. To some degree. Maybe some wouldn't. Maybe some would do the right thing and understand what this meant. But I don't want to be harsh on Joshua in the sense of, well, I would never do this. But Joshua really should have known that God is faithful. And that God is not to be blamed at all for this, as he seemed to blame him. Why have you done this, God? Why have you allowed us to come here just to destroy us? Well, he had already seen. Keep in mind, Joshua was one of the last people of his generation to have seen the things that he saw in Egypt, to see the power of God, to be with Israel all through the wilderness as an adult, and then to come into the land. So Joshua should be able to recall the great faithfulness of God all through that time. But he seems at this stage to have lost a little bit of faith and act a little bit. To act unfaithfully, to be frank. And God rebukes him. Instead of seeking for the cause of the calamity in God, which is kind of what he was doing, at least when he makes his first prayer, that first supplication, he ought to seek it in the sin of the people. Joshua should have known, even without divine revelation, that the people had committed some sin. And I think that's why God says, get up. Why are you on your face? I think Joshua should have been able to figure this out when he considers all that God has done in the past. But he's very clear to Joshua. He says the reason they are defeated, the reason why the people have been defeated is because they have transgressed. They have acted unfaithfully to me. That is why they were defeated in Ai on that occasion. And that is really why they would have suffered defeat in the wilderness. You remember Kadesh Barnea when the people were told not to go, and then God said, okay, you won't get to go for 40 years. And the people rush up and go into the land, and what happens? They're defeated. And they're defeated because they're not believing God. They're not acting with God, and are not acting in faith. And so whenever Israel was defeated in the wilderness, and there wasn't many times, that was the one time I could think of offhand, when they were defeated in the wilderness, it was because of a lack of faith. And Joshua should have been able to figure that out. And God tells him as a very straightforward, Israel has sinned. They have acted unfaithful to the Lord. And by the way, their unfaithfulness wasn't that they wanted in their promised land. Because that's what God had promised. To give them the promised land. Their unfaithfulness was somewhere else. It was somewhere else. God tells Joshua in verse 11, Israel has sinned, Israel has been unfaithful, and they have also transgressed my covenant which I commanded them, and they have even taken some of the things under the ban, and have both stolen and deceived. Moreover, they have put them among their own things. When you look at what God says here in these verses, it's interesting. And Delitzsch comments about this, and I think his comments are appropriate to read. He says, this sin was a breach of the covenant, being a transgression of the obligation into which the people had entered in their covenant with the Lord to keep His commandments. And that's found in Exodus 19 and verse 8, and also in Exodus 24:7, when they said, all the Lord has said we will do. And so it's a breach of the covenant. Yea, it was a grasping at the ban, and a theft, and a concealment, and an appropriation of that which was stolen to their own use. The first three clauses describes the sin in its relation to God as a grievous offense. The three following accord to its true character as the great, obstinate, and reckless crime. In other words, when it says Israel has been unfaithful, they have transgressed my covenant, they have taken some of the things under the ban, is how God sees this. This is what they have done to God. And then the others really kind of gives it more of an earthly sense, where they have stolen, they have lied, and they have taken something to use for their own use that they shouldn't have ever done. And they put it among their own stuff. And that which was consecrated to the Lord. It was not God who failed Israel. Israel had failed God by acting unfaithfully. And though this unfaithful behavior was just the act of one man, the whole congregation came under the curse. The whole congregation was made to suffer the physical consequences of a sin. Now sometimes that boggles our mind. How can one person's sin affect so many? Well, we go back, if we know anything about the Bible, we know that the sin of Adam and Eve surely affected the many. But even on a more a modern time, a man who is a drunkard affects the whole family. Does he not? One man being a drunkard affects the whole family. One man being an adulterer affects the whole family, or a woman being an adulteress affects the whole family. I mean, one sin that you commit can affect a whole lot of people. And I was thinking of examples when the Persians attacked the Greeks, and they were shown, or pardon me, when the Persians attacked the Medo-Persians, it was, I guess the Greeks attacked the Persians, and they went across the mountains. Hannibal, I'm trying to think, was he a Persian or a Greek? Hannibal was a Persian, right? I believe it was. Anyway, but my point is, I don't want it, but when he comes across the mountain, one person showed him the way. One person who is a traitor shows the way to this secret passage that they never thought to guard because nobody knew about it, and the whole city fell. I'm just saying, one sin can affect a lot of people. And here we see an occasion where Achan's sin affected the entire congregation. The whole congregation suffered the physical consequences of his sin. And as a result of the sin, of one man's sin, God's wrath was poured out on the whole congregation, and the people were told that they could escape further defeat and further consequences only by purging the wickedness from their midst. And God said that this would be by burning the culprit and all that belongs to him with fire. And we read this and we shudder. But I want to remind us that we learn something about the gravity of this sin by the punishment that God placed upon it. This was a grievous sin. And God never gives a punishment that does not fit the crime. We learn before they burned them, they stoned them with stones. The whole congregation was involved in stoning them with stone, and then they were burned. But the point is that it just shows the severity of this crime. This was an affront against God. They had taken something under the ban, and now they have to deal with this. Now again, one man did the sin, but the whole congregation has to be involved in purging it because the whole congregation was involved in the consequences of this sin. And so they all had to be involved. And God would reveal the identity of this culprit in His own way. In other words, it wasn't through a miraculous thing in the sense of, well, here he is, but God did it by a process. And this process is revealed that He would take 12 representatives of the tribes, I guess 12 heads, and then God would pick out which one, And in this case, it would be Judah. And then from Judah, he would pick out all the others, and then it would be narrowed and narrowed, until finally it came down to a man-to-man thing. And I wonder, when I think about this, what was Achan thinking as it kept getting closer and closer and closer to him? I don't know, but I would have thought he would have been very uncomfortable at this stage, realizing that he is going to be revealed. It's going to be made known to him. And finally, we do learn that this is exactly what happens. Take up the reading in verse 16. So Joshua arose early in the morning and brought Israel near by tribes, and the tribe of Judah was taken. He brought the family of Judah near and took the family of the Zerahites, and he brought the family of the Zerahites near man by man, and Zabdi was taken. He brought his household near man by man, and Achan, the son of Carmi, the son of Zabdi, the son of Zerah, from the tribe of Judah was taken. Then Joshua says to Achan, my son, I implore you, give glory to God, the God of Israel, and give praise to him, and tell me now what you have done. Do not hide it from me. So Achan answered Joshua and said, truly I have sinned against the Lord, the God of Israel, and this is what I did. When I saw among the spoil a beautiful mantle from Shinar, 200 shekels of silver, and a bar of gold 50 shekels in weight, then I coveted them and took them, and behold, they are concealed in the earth inside my tent, with the silver underneath. So Joshua sent messengers, and they ran to the tent, and behold, it was concealed in the tent with the silver underneath it. They took them from inside the tent and brought them to Joshua and to all the house of Israel, sons of Israel, and they poured them out before the Lord. So when Joshua says to Achan, because Achan was finally taken, his first statement to Achan was, my son, in verse 19. This is not a hypocritical statement. I really believe that that Joshua, though he already knew what was to be done with Achan, really felt sorry for this man in a sort of way. I mean, who cannot pity the individual who is about to suffer the fate of Achan? Who could not have some pity upon him? And he says, my son, I believe this is a genuine appeal to this man. This genuine appeal to him to come clean. To come clean. He doesn't say, you thief, you evildoer. He just says, my son, appealing to him in a common way, in a way that shows concern for him. Tell me what you've done. Don't keep it back. And then Achan says to him, of truth, I have sinned. I have sinned, in verse 20. And it's important to note for us that when we see physical death inflicted upon people for capital crimes in the Old Testament, that this does not always mean eternal condemnation. It does not always mean eternal condemnation of those who thus died. Adam Clark wrote in his commentary, he said, this seems to be a very honest and hearty confession that we are about to hear. And there is hope that this poor culprit escaped perdition. And I hope so too. I don't know if he did or not. But I want to say that there's nothing that focuses our mind on eternity more than knowing you're going to die. And this man understood his situation. And I'll tell you, if he doesn't make it right now, he will never have another chance. And I believe his confession is honest. He does tell us what happened, and he tells us how it happened as well. Look at what he says, how he describes his sin in verse 21. I'm going to summarize it. He said, I saw, I coveted, I took. I saw, I coveted, I took. Here, the three steps of the commission of sins. Here they are. And really, this is the three steps that we take really involved in many of our sins and much of our sins. And these are exactly the same steps taken by Eve in the garden. She saw, she coveted, and she took. She desired this tree to make her wise. The exact same way. You know, sin always begins in the mind. Always begins in the mind. As a work of art begins in the mind, and then it is externalized on the canvas or on the whatever you're making. You first imagine it, then you put it down on canvas, or you make it with your hands. So does sin. So does sin. And in this case, sin entered the mind through his eyes. He saw. He saw. As Eve saw the forbidden fruit, and as she was charmed with its sight, so was Achan. See what happens when we allow our hearts to walk after the eyes? This is what happens when we allow our hearts to walk after what we see. No wonder the Lord warns us about what we see. And so the children's song really is right. Watch your eyes, what they see. As we go through the Scriptures, we see many statements about this. For example, in Proverbs 28, in Proverbs 28, or 23 and verse 31, the wise man says, do not look on the wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup, when it goes down smoothly. Do not look at the wine when it is this way. In Job 31 and verse 1, Job said he made a covenant with his eyes. How then can I gaze on a virgin? He understood the danger of looking too long. And Jesus teaches the same in His Sermon on the Mount. You remember what He says? He said, you've heard that it says you should not commit adultery. And then He goes on and He says, but I say to you that everyone who looks on a woman with lust has already committed adultery in his heart. And then He goes on and He said, if your eye causes you to stumble, pluck it out. In other words, take drastic action. Sin comes through the eyes. No wonder the Lord gave us such warnings as this. To watch what you see. Achan said, I saw. I saw. And then he said, I coveted, and then I took. We surely must watch our eyes, what we see. And then we read the conclusion of the matter in verse 24 through 26 of Joshua 7. Then Joshua and all of Israel with him took Achan the son of Zerah, the silver, the mantle, the bar of gold, his sons, his daughters, and brought them up to the valley of Achan. And Joshua said, why have you troubled us? The Lord will trouble you this day. And all Israel stoned him with stones, and they burned them with fire, after they had stoned them with stones. And they raised over him a great heap of stones that stands to this day. And the Lord turned from the fierceness of His anger. Therefore the name of that place has been called the Valley of Achan to this day. God had warned Israel, but Achan did not believe. And so he, his family, and all of his possessions were destroyed. All of them. And again, I wish to point out that the penalty that God inflicted upon Achan is an indication of just how grievous this sin was and how grievous this crime was. Regarding the family being destroyed, great speculation has been made, but I want to remind you that it was God who commanded this to be done. And we often think, his family, what about these little children? How do we know they were little children? Now, it seemed to me, and this is my opinion, that somehow the family became involved in this. They knew, and yet they didn't do anything about it. So they became partakers. That's my opinion. But even if I don't know why the whole family was destroyed, I do know that God commanded it. So I know it's right. It's right. We don't always have to understand why God commands something. We just have to understand that God always does the right thing and commands the right thing. But this shows just how grievous this sin was. And after this was taken care of and the sin was dealt with, guess what? Israel defeated Ai. And they went on to win defeat, or won victory, over and over and over again in the land. The New Testament tells us that the Old Testament was written in some way for our example, to give us some lessons. So what lessons, if any, are we to learn from this story? Well, there are several. I want to go back to the faith of Israel when they conquered Jericho, because I want to emphasize that as well as some other things. But God gave a battle plan that really did take faith to accomplish. I mean, who ever heard of such a plan as this? To take the city by marching around it. Nobody talking, blowing the horns once a day for 6 days, 7 times on the 7th day, and then shouting. That took great faith for the Israel camp to do that. And that's a good example to learn, because let me tell you what, God always demands us to act in faith in our lives as we please Him. And sometimes what He commands may seem odd, and it may seem strange, but we need to know that whenever we do what God says, then God's purpose will be accomplished. God's purpose will be accomplished. So that's the first thing I want to remind us about. But secondly, I want us to be reminded of the fact that God is no more apt to give victory to His people today when there are grievous sins among them than He was in the days of Joshua. Now again, I want to back off from this statement and make a little bit of an observation. When Noah preached during the time of the ark, nobody else was saved but his family from the flood. This does not mean there was any sin in his family. Sometimes people's hearts are just hardened. And no matter what you do, no matter what you say, it's not going to have any effect upon anybody. And I want to make that clear, because that's the way it is. We can't always say because God's will is not accomplished as freely or as much as it could be, then therefore it must be sin in the camp. That's not the case. Because sometimes we just live in a society that will not listen. But having said that, there are times when the will of God among His people is not accomplished because there is sin in the camp. And whenever there is sin among His people and sin in the camp, then how can we expect God to give us a victory? How can we expect God to give us that victory? He can't be expected to. No more than He could be expected to in the days of Joshua. If there is sin in the camp, the influence of the church, her power to resist sin, her power to resist error, is lost if there is sin in the camp. Satan is sure to gain a victory. Sure to gain a victory against any such army when there's sin in the camp. The church cannot stand before her enemies when sin dwells within her. Just can't do it. Just can't do it at all. We must therefore individually, and I mean we need to look into ourselves and individually take care and lay aside all sins, all idols which may have been enthroned in our hearts by ourselves. All things that are not worthy of being of our calling, all things that are not worthy of what God has called us to be, need to be removed from us. And that's something we do individually. Whenever I consider things in my life, the first person I look to is myself. What have I done to make this worse? What have I done to maybe cause there to be a hindrance? If my family is going bad, I don't say, well, it's all Patty's fault. Or it's all my kids' fault. I look at myself and I say, well, what have I done? Have I done something? And I mean, we have to do that honestly and deal with it once we discover that there is something in my life that has stopped this from doing right. And the same is true within the congregation of God. We look around and we wonder, why are things sometimes the way they are? Why don't we seem to be growing? Why don't we seem to be at harmony with one another? Why is this not here? And the first people we need to look at is ourselves. Look in the mirror, examine yourself, and be honest. Be like Achan. What have you done? And then give it some thought. It was clear to Achan what he had done. Sometimes it's not so clear to us because of other things in our lives. But we need to look at ourselves and wonder, what have I done? What have I done? And then make the correction. Make the correction if we want to make God happy and if we want to help the church here in this place to grow. Furthermore, When sin is found among us, we must deal with it as a congregation. And I don't mean, and somebody said, well, we all sin. And that's true. But the thing is, not all of us are trying to rid sin from our lives. Many of us are sinning, but we are repenting and trying to correct the error in our life. And that's good, and that's what ought to be done. But if sin is to be found in the congregation that is not repented of and not changed, then the congregation must act on those situations. They must act. And again, let me remind us, we're aware of this. If a sin is private, then we need to go to that person. The first person you should tell is not the preacher, or if we had elders, the elder. The first person you need to go to if the sin is private is the person who has sinned, and say, this is what you are guilty of. This is what I believe you are doing this wrong. And deal with it that way. Because it may be that once the person is confronted with their sin, they may repent. And they may be like Achan and say, yes, I've done those things, and please pray with me that the thoughts and intentions of my heart may be forgiven. But then if it does not succeed and we have to go through this process and the church is now made aware of this, the church must act. When Paul found sin in the camp of the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 5, he told them to purge out. To purge out. Put away the wicked man from among yourselves. He reminded them that a little leaven leavens the whole lump. And anybody who's never cooked and knows anything about leaven knows how true that is. You cannot have a little leaven in a piece of dough. It'll always get bigger. It'll never stay little. It always grows. And when sin is allowed to stay in the congregation, I'm talking about known sin is allowed to stay in the congregation, it will embolden the others. And it will be passed on to the others. And so eventually the whole congregation gets infected with this leaven. And so we're reminded by Paul that a little leaven will leaven the whole lump of dough. Put away the wicked man from you. And then he wrote to the Romans when they were being troubled by false teachers. He says in Romans 6:17, now I beseech you, brethren, mark them that are causing divisions and occasions of stumbling contrary to the doctrine which you learned, and turn away from them. So again, this idea of ridding yourself, ridding the congregation from such men who would do such things. Sin and error always have a demoralizing effect upon the congregation and a weakening effect upon the congregation. So sin must be kept out of the army of the Lord. And we are the army of God. We are the soldiers of Christ. We don't fight with swords made by human hands, but we wield the gospel, the sword of the Spirit. And we are that army. And the church must be kept pure, and if she is to continue to win battles, she must take note there must be no sin in the camp. Every soldier must remember that his or her conduct may well determine what can be accomplished by the church. And you may say, that's not fair. Why should one person's reputation affect the whole church? It may not be fair, but that's the way it is. The whole congregation will be judged by the conduct of one person. And that's the way it is. And it can't be changed. Because we live in a world that will judge us in that sort of way. And our response to this will say a lot to the people who are here, who are living lives of hypocrisy in the world itself. Do you remember what happened to Ananias and Sapphira? When it was revealed, their hypocrisy was revealed. And then, as it goes down in the verse, it said, none of the rest dared to join them. And you're thinking, well, who are these rest? Because after that, we see the church was still growing. So who are the rest? And my personal belief is that the rest are the rest of the hypocrites, like Ananias and Sapphira, who knew that if they were in this group and they got caught, they may have the same fate. And so discipline does have an effect upon other people. They will see, we take our Christianity seriously. We take it seriously, we want to do the right thing, and we will do the right thing. So that's what will happen. If we keep the camp pure, it will have an effect upon the rest of us. and the community itself. And they will see that if this happens, it's an anomaly. It's not the norm. But when it becomes the norm and we accept it, the community will see this and our influence will surely be destroyed. And so we must do the thing that we need to be doing when sin is in the camp. We need not to have people like Achan in the camp. We must not have people like this man living with his father's wife in the camp. We must not have sinful activities going on among us and then just tolerate it and not do things about it, because that will surely affect the group. It will affect our influence. It will hinder us from doing what God wants us to do. And I guarantee it will end up destroying the congregation here at this place. I didn't mean to do this, but when I wrote my last report, I made a comment, something of that nature. And it was funny that I got about 2 or 3 responses from people outside who I sent the report to and said, kind of said, take heart. I didn't think I was being discouraged, because I'm not discouraged. I was just making an observation, being a little bit perplexed about why things are happening. And they said, take heart. And one brother in Italy said, we live in a world today that just doesn't want to hear the gospel. And that's so true. Like I said, not a lack of growth, a lack of things going on that are for the growth of the church is not always mean there's a problem in the church. It just may mean we live in a very bad society who doesn't want to listen. But I think that sometimes there is problems that we need to be dealing with in a godly sort of way. And if these aren't being dealt with, then we need to deal with them. We need to gird up our loins and deal with them. And let me say, from experience, I have had to withdraw fellowship from my own children. It really is painful. She was sitting in the audience. When we withdrew from her, and when I was teaching this lesson, I didn't break down. It was a stab in the heart. And sometimes we just have to buck up and realize that it has to be done. It has to be done. But it hurts. It's hard, yes. I think Joshua had real compassion upon this man. My son, what have you done? What have you done? And it reached that man. And if his confession was genuine from the heart, which I think we have no reason to believe otherwise, then who's to say he's not with the righteous today? Because he made that confession. And I just want to say that we need to be alert to these things, and we must not be afraid to take whatever action needs to be taken whether there's sin in the camp. We must not be afraid. We must not let nepotism get in our way. We must not let friendships get in our way. We must do whatever needs to be done to help the work of the Lord here in this place. So let us take these things to heart. These are lessons that we need to have. And let us be thoughtful about the situation here. And if I discover that it's me, that I have sinned, then I need to make it right with the Lord. And probably I need to make it right with you, because I have been a stumbling block. But that would be what I would need to do. Perhaps you would need to do the same, if it were you. So the lesson is yours. Some good lessons from Joshua 6. and chapter 7. Hopeful lessons in chapter 6, where men acted by faith, accomplished the will of God. A hard lesson in chapter 7, where the people have to discipline one of their own members in order to make things right with the Lord. Let's learn from that. And let us make sure we act accordingly to what we have to do. If you're here today and you're subject to the invitation of the gospel, why not come forward and stand and sing the last?